As much as policy might be influencing voter preferences, any election with Donald Trump is still inescapably an election about Donald Trump. As a former Republican staffer for George W. Bush and staff writer at The Atlantic magazine, David Frum is a celebrated observer and analyst of national politics and global affairs. We sat down in his office and I asked him to assess the state of the race.
It's been a very dramatic election. Last-minute substitution of one presidential candidate for another, more startling events than you can imagine. In other ways, it's been a not dramatic election. In one way, you could say really nothing has happened much in American politics since 2016. That we have had a substantial minority of the country that accepts what Donald Trump is doing, and we've had a diffuse and messy coalition of the majority of the country that rejects it. And the one question in politics has been, can the anti-Trump majority unite effectively against the pro-Trump minority? In 2016, the answer was no. In 2020, the answer was yes. We're awaiting the answer for 2024.
The polling suggests the race is pretty close at the moment.
Yeah.
This time next week, who do you think the president-elect is likely to be?
I think in democracies, even in this one with many archaic, unrepresentative features, the majority tends to get its way. There have been consistently more people who reject what Donald Trump is trying to do than support it. I think that will, the weight of numbers will tell. As the presidency goes, so usually goes the House of Representatives. But the Senate is its own set of rules, and it looks like the Republicans will have a Senate majority. So if Kamala Harris does become president, it's going to be a very balanced government. Democrats in control probably of the presidency, probably of the House, but almost certainly not the Senate.
You have opposed Donald Trump since he first came down that escalator. But despite the assorted views of his personal character, despite January 6th, his support remains strong for tens of millions of Americans. Why is that?
Look, democracy is a radical idea, always has been. And in maybe some of the easy years after World War II, we lost sight of how big its claims were. These are more testing times. And the idea that every citizen's opinion and vote should count, that women should count equally with men, that we can all benefit together rather than some at the expense of others, that we find prosperity through trading freely, and we find security by working with our partners. These are radical and in some ways strange ideas. So maybe it's not altogether surprising. There are people who say, no, some people should count more than others. Men should count more than women. We get rich by keeping out products from the world and just hiding behind our own walls. And we get safe by being domineering and bullying rather than by working in cooperation with others.
You think that's what it is?
I think that's the rational part of the Trump message, to which he adds his own personality deformations. I think some people find it exciting. Look, the Colosseum in Rome stood for 500 years. There were 2 shows a week. Apparently it was filled all the time, to watch people hacking each other into little pieces or being devoured by wild beasts or burnt at the stake. There is something in us that enjoys the spectacle of cruelty. That's just part of what it means to be human. There's another part, we hope, as we become more civilized, the more dominant part, that rejects cruelty. But cruelty is exciting, and Donald Trump offers a theater of cruelty, and of course it's mesmerizing.
Do Donald Trump supporters have legitimacy in their grievances?
I think at this point we can say pretty clearly that whatever grievances are attributed don't seem to be motivating the vote. Right now, 2024, the American economy is at its strongest than probably any time since the middle 1960s. Employment is at capacity. Inflation has been overcome. Wages are rising faster than prices. Prices have ceased to rise and in some cases are going into reverse. The reason the biggest problem the country faces is at the border, the flow of immigration, and that is produced by the giant "we're hiring" sign that is blaring over the United States to the rest of the world. And obviously you have to regulate the flow of people, but the people are coming because they say this is the strongest job market on the planet. So we ought to be able to say, yes, immigration a problem caused by the incredibly powerful, dynamic American economy, which is the reason why you vote for the incumbent, not for the challenger.
So why don't more Americans appreciate that?
Well, as I said, I think there is always an appreciation for dominance, for cruelty. Trump is saying to policy things, which is we should put up barriers against trade and we should abandon our allies overseas. And that is a message that has often appealed to Americans in the past. It's always led to grief for others, for Americans as well as for others, but Americans have hearkened to that message before, and Donald Trump is trying to give it to them again.
What concerns you most about a second term of Donald Trump?
It will be chaos. The first thing that Donald Trump return to office will try to do is to shut down all the many legal investigations against him, state as well as federal, civil as well as criminal. Presidents don't have the power to do that. So the only way he'll be able to even try is by smashing up the legal system as we've known it. And he will encounter tremendous resistance. So while he's trying to pardon his January 6 co-criminals, while he's trying to escape liability for himself from his civil offenses, while he's trying to pardon himself for his crimes, there are going to be uproar. There will be uproar in Congress. There'll be protests in the streets. There'll be cases in the courts. The government will seize up and paralyze. And meanwhile, the predators, who always roam around the edge of the democratic world, they will see their opportunity. And so the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, the North Koreans, who are finding many common causes in the war in Ukraine, for example, they will be looking for prey. And the United States will be too distracted to offer the protection that Americans have offered in the past.
What would a Trump presidency mean for Ukraine?
Oh, I think it means Donald Trump is not wrong when he says he has a plan to end the war in Ukraine. His plan is to abandon Ukraine and give it to the Russians, and that will end the war in Ukraine, that he'll cut off the aid. At Trump's urging, under his manipulation, his party last year stopped aid to Ukraine for 9 months. Hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers, maybe thousands, died for lack of the equipment because it was stopped in Congress by Donald Trump and his allies. Now, eventually that blockade was overcome, and the aid was approved and began to flow again, along with aid to Israel and to Taiwan, along with necessary material for the border, to protect the border. Trump stopped all of that. So his running mate, J.D. Vance, who will be important because Trump is aging and fading and less energetic. J.D. Vance is intelligent and hardworking and will get to the office at 7. Donald Trump won't get to the office until 11 or noon. He is the most insistent anti-Ukraine voice in the entire United States Congress. So he will be raising his voice, and Trump will appoint others. So the outlook for Ukraine is grim, and the outlook for the Middle East is not good either, because while Trump always talks a lot about his support for the state of Israel, the isolationist mentality, Israel won't be exempted from it.
She took on the candidacy with this huge wave of enthusiasm and support, but how do you assess Kamala Harris's candidacy?
Kamala Harris is a creature of party consensus. In that way, she is like Joe Biden, or she's like Gerald Ford on the Republican side half a century ago, that she is the point where all the factions of the Democratic Party converge and agree. So she's not someone who has been at the cutting edge of some cause, the way Barack Obama was, nor is she a person with a vast and well-known record, the way even as young as Bill Clinton was in 1992, he had been talked about as a party leader for 12 years before that. This is someone who represents, I think, the Democratic Party as a unity, and I believe is aware that she will be coming into office, if she does, with a Republican Senate. So she will have to work by compromise and consensus. She can't lead from the front.
Was it a strategic mistake not to go through a more competitive process in securing the nomination?
Well, that wasn't a possible question. You can't say something is a strategic mistake when it was sort of inevitable. To say, was it a strategic mistake for it to rain that day? I don't know. It's a...
Well, I suppose within the Democrat Party, they could have decided to have some sort of a contested convention, for example.
American parties don't work like parties in Westminster democracies. There isn't really a Democratic Party. There are a lot of...
There's no one pulling the strings.
There are a lot of participants who carry the Democratic label, who often are who are much more hostile to each other than their counterparts in the Republican Party are, and who are maneuvering each for his or her own purposes. And the outcome is what the Democratic Party does. But there's no there's no secret room where the Democratic Party can make decisions.
Well, flip it around then. From the Harris campaign perspective, was it a strategic mistake not to have the appearance of a more competitive nomination process that might offer her more legitimacy than this process?
Harris heads a coalition that spans the terrain from Bernie Sanders, the socialist senator from Vermont, to Dick Cheney, George Bush's vice president. She's been endorsed by all of those people and by everyone in between. She's been endorsed by, I think, every living immediate relative of a past Republican president or presidential nominee, from Gerald Ford's children to I think Mitt Romney's children. They've all endorsed her. So it's a big, messy coalition. And so the question is, would it be good, would it be smart to take all of this messy coalition, put them into a room together and have them explore how much they actually dislike each other? That probably would not be a good idea. That right now, that's going to happen after she's elected. If she's elected, there will be a lot of disharmony within a Harris administration. But for now, she has to hold together the very messy 53% that oppose Donald Trump for many different kinds of reasons and that don't necessarily agree with each other.
What is it like for you to see people like Dick Cheney and Liz Cheney supporting Kamala Harris?
I come from their political tradition. I share, I'm sure, many more points of commonality with Liz Cheney than I do with Kamala Harris. And I salute Liz Cheney and Dick Cheney, too, for understanding what Americans ought to have in common. There are a lot of things that Americans rightly argue about. The role of government in the economy. How important is it to have a more equal society versus having a more enterprising society? Those are trade-offs. You can have more equal means less enterprising, more enterprising means less equal. How much of which do you choose? The only way to decide those questions is to put it up for a show of hands and to try it one way for 4 years and then to try it a different way for another 4 years. Those are the things we argue about. But here's what we shouldn't be arguing about. If you lose an election, do you concede graciously and wait your turn next time? And maybe try to fix up your idea so you're more competitive next time. Or do you turn to violence and fraud to try to overturn the result? If the Cheneys and those who admire them say, look, if you lose, it's on you. You have to step aside and you have to retool. What else do we broadly agree on? When a Democratic ally is under attack, should you help them or should you abandon them? Does the United States have more in common with Ukraine, Taiwan, and Israel than it has in common with Russia, China, and Iran, and North Korea? And the Cheneys say, we want to work with Democratic allies, not with these authoritarian aggressors. We don't identify with the world's dictators. Should the President of the United States operate a business and take payments from domestic industries and from foreign powers while serving as president? We should all be able to agree that no, the president should not be taking side payments while working as president. He should not be asking visiting foreign dignitaries as the first question in the meeting, did you stay in my hotel? And if they didn't stay in his hotel, they get a worse treatment than if they did stay in his hotel. None of that should be happening. And that's something that everybody should agree on, whatever your feelings about the relative balance between equality and enterprise in your society.
How concerned should we be about a contested result?
We should be very concerned because we have seen it happen before. We saw in 2020. One of the arguments that those of us who began writing about Donald Trump early said, if he loses, he won't accept it. And the people around Donald Trump said, don't be ridiculous. In fact, there was an op-ed in the New York Times by one of his former chiefs of staff saying, if he loses, Trump will concede graciously. That was the headline. Well, indeed, he first by fraud and then by violence tried to overturn the result. I don't do it anymore, but I used to, for my sins, sometimes do inauguration morning television. And that is no picnic. There's no party because you start at 9 a.m., nothing's going to happen until noon. It's usually really cold, and there's nothing to say for 3 hours. And so you're on these frozen metal bleachers, filling time. And the way people often fill time is by talking about the majesty of the 2-century tradition of the peaceful transition of power. Now, this is a little self-congratulatory because when one Danish prime minister steps away from the royal palace to hail a taxi, and the incoming Danish prime minister, they don't make such a thing about that they have. In New Zealand, you don't you just do it. But anyway, it was a thing we talked about. We can't talk about it anymore because our tradition of peaceful transition of power is exactly 0 years old. We have a shorter tradition of peaceful transitions of power than Moldova or the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which both had peaceful transitions in 2019. We had a violent transition in 2020. And that is something we really need to process. That is part of what has happened to American democracy because of Donald Trump. And we have to wonder, will we have a violent contest in 2024? No other democracy would tolerate for a minute. I mean, imagine somebody in New Zealand saying, if I lose, my followers and I are going to take guns and try to stop the winner from taking power. Not just offensive, but unthinkable, impossible. Couldn't happen. Who'd follow you? But people followed, Trump led and people followed.
Do you think violence or civil unrest is likely?
I think much less this time, because last time Donald Trump controlled the mechanisms of state power. He could keep the National Guard away from Capitol Hill. He could have the army on some kind of standby, so it didn't defend the institutions of government. He can't do that now. Joe Biden will be the president until Inauguration Day, and he will give whatever orders are necessary to keep the Capitol safe from violent people. And Donald Trump's followers in 2021 were following a sitting president. Now, in a democracy, you don't obey the president, you obey the law. You obey the president because he's the person in charge of executing the law, but you don't follow the president for his own personality. You follow him as the person charged with executing the laws. And yet there are people who thought, well, if the president says it, it must be legal. Donald Trump won't be the president, so whatever he calls for, it will be plainly illegal. And one more thing, his followers will have seen that although this society has found it very difficult to hold Donald Trump to account for what happened in 2021, he's been convicted of crimes, but not those relating to his 2021 coup. Hundreds of his followers have gone to prison for their part. And so you should know, if you're a follower of Donald Trump, that while he may evade responsibility for his crimes, you will not.
What will a new president mean for security in the Indo-Pacific?
Donald Trump is very vocally anti-China. But it's important to understand he sees China as something to blame for domestic policies, something to use to mobilize hatred and rancor inside the United States. He does not intend ever to offer actual protection to allies threatened by China. The most dramatic example of this has been his recent interviews about Taiwan, where he's made clear that he is not interested in protecting Taiwan. He thinks he's prepared to write off Taiwan. And he's interested instead in pursuing both his own personal, his family's relationship with the rulers of China. The United States, during the Cold War, faced in the Soviet Union a power that was militarily capable, but not an economic or technological equal. In China, the United States does face a country that is less militarily threatening than the old Soviet Union was, but much more of an economic, financial, technological competitor. And it's large. It is a country with a bigger population. When the United States faced Germany, technologically capable, but half the population. China is too big for the United States to balance by itself. It must have partners. And it must have not only the familiar, long-standing partners with whom we share language and values like Australia and New Zealand, but some new partners who are going to be more awkward to deal with. Malaysia, Indonesia, India, Vietnam, these are all more difficult to work with. And it's going to take a lot of diplomacy, a lot of new structures of security to build the kind of balance in the Pacific that will keep the peace. Because the goal here is to prevent China from doing bad things, not to do bad things to China. We should welcome China's rise to prosperity, and we hope someday turn to democracy and liberalism. So security comes from leaders who understand the indispensability of broad coalitions, both with familiar and easy friends and with new and more difficult friends.
New Zealand is walking the line at the moment, trying to balance our trading relationship with China and our security relationship with the Five Eyes partners. How will a new president change that dynamic?
Well, what I hope the right kind of presidency would recognize, the United States is walking this exact same fine line, because we also want to maintain a trading relationship with China. And we don't want to give up hoping for the best. The progress in China over the past 30 years has been one of the most important and benign stories in the history of the human race. Hundreds of millions of people lifted out of poverty. That's good. China returned to making goods and services of use to the rest of humanity. That's good. that has put resource in the hands of an authoritarian government to threaten neighbors, that's bad. So what we want to continue to do is exactly what New Zealand wants to continue to do, which is to maximize the benefits in this relationship, coax it to the extent of our power onto a benign future path, but be ready in case, through none of our doing, the Chinese insist on a more confrontational approach to the rest of the world. And we need all of us. None of us is big enough to face China alone, not the United States either. We all need to maintain relationships, and difficult new ones, with countries that are not democracies and with whom we have important disagreements, but who can reach a common understanding on security at least.
If Trump is defeated, is Trumpism defeated?
There are authoritarian tendencies in every human heart. We will know that a certain percentage of our fellow creatures will respond to fear of strangers, to the desire of men to dominate women, to superstition over science. That's just part of what it means. So if that's to the extent that Trumpism speaks to those parts of our nature, it will never go away. And we have long traditions of Americans turning their back on the outside world. That this country's so big and so rich, and it's got oceans on two sides, and Canada on one, and Mexico on the other. There don't seem to be many threats. So the idea that you need to work with people all over the world to create security, that is an idea that Americans have had trouble with for a long time. So that won't go away. The delusion that you can get rich by putting up tariff walls, that people are always succumbing to that delusion, and we will continue. But the kind of violence, cruelty, criminality, that probably will look like a loser forever if Donald Trump goes down to defeat.